Good evening. I'm very pleased to welcome you here tonight. 100 years ago today, for the very first time, American women awoke with a constitutional right to vote. I can't imagine how wonderful that must have been. This was a landmark voting rights victory, and in celebration, we've put together a great program for you tonight. My name is Pamela Oedner, president of the American Women's Club of Amsterdam, and co-host with the United States Mission in the Netherlands and the John Adams Institute for our program, 100 Years of Voting, Women's Rights and Responsibilities. Before we begin, I'd like to start off by going over the program with you quickly. We will start with a walk back through time and a virtual tour of the United States National Archives exhibit, Rightfully Hers, American Women and the Vote, with curator Corinne Porter. This should last about 25 minutes and will be followed with a live Q&A with Corinne. You'll be able to click the chat button at the bottom of your Zoom screen and a pop-up will appear where you can write in your questions and submit them. After our tour, we will sit down with Congresswoman Liz Cheney, who hails from the great equality state of Wyoming. She will field questions that were submitted by you, the audience, in a frank discussion on the importance of women's participation in the electoral process. This will be moderated by Tracy Metz, director of the John Adams Institute and my co-host for the evening. It should last about 30 minutes. We will close our program with a few words from our very own U.S. Consul General in Amsterdam, and my other co-host, Jennifer DeWitt Walsh. If you've never been to the U.S. National Archives, you may not know that there's a statue outside guarding its entrance. You should see an image of this statue on your screen now. As you can see, it depicts a proud, strong warrior holding his helmet and sword and keeping constant watch to protect us. If you look more closely, you will see its inscription: "Eternal vigilance is the price of liberty." As we planned this event, it seemed to us that this message was particularly poignant and relevant. 100 years of struggle for the women's right to vote. And even with what's happening today with the Black Lives Matter movement, what is clear is that liberty and freedom are not simply handed to us. We must be constantly vigilant to ensure that we maintain and continue to promote these precious rights. Now, how do we protect these rights? One way is through the work of our nation's National Archives. Now, I'm sure many of you have had to clean out your closets or applied for a loan or paid your taxes, and you know very well the importance of keeping family records. It's not an easy or often welcome task, but vital nevertheless. But think about if you were tasked with having to identify, organize, and maintain the records for an entire country. This is the job of the U.S. National Archives. They are our nation's record keeper. As noted in the Archives website, in a democracy, records belong to the people. They help us claim our rights and entitlements, hold our elected officials accountable for their actions, and document our history as a nation. The National Archives is the home of the 19th Amendment, and for our purposes this evening, we will be taking a close look at this powerful document 100 years after it was added to the Constitution. The cornerstone of the National Archives celebration of the 19th Amendment is its exhibit, Rightfully Hers, American Women and the Vote. The exhibit uses the archives records to, quote, illustrate the dynamic involvement of women across the spectrum of race, ethnicity, and class to reveal what it really took to win the vote for half of the people. As mentioned earlier, it is curated by Corinne Porter. Corinne has worked at the National Archives since 2007 and joined the exhibits team in 2013. She curates the National Archives Museum's Public Vaults permanent exhibition, She was the curator for One Victory in 2015, a curator for the World War II photography exhibition on the U.S. mission to Kazakhstan, lead researcher for Making Their Mark, Stories Through Signatures in 2014, and curator of the Rights of Native Americans interactive table exhibit in the Record of Rights permanent exhibition in 2013. She holds a bachelor's degree in history from Western New England University and a master's in museum studies from Johns Hopkins University. I will leave you now with our moderator for our program, Tracy Metz, director of the John Adams Institute. I hope you enjoy your evening.
Thank you, Pam. With no further ado, I just want to add that we at the John Adams Institute are thrilled to be part of this event about such an important moment in American and women's history, and to be collaborating with the American Women's Club of Amsterdam, of which I myself am, of course, a member, and our Consulate General with Consul General Jennifer DeWitt Walsh here to do the closing remarks today. So, with no further ado, let's move to Corinne.
Thank you, Pam and Tracy, and thank you to the U.S. Mission Netherlands, the U.S. Consulate General Amsterdam, the American Women's Club of Amsterdam, and the John Adams Institute for putting together this exciting program to commemorate the 100th anniversary of the ratification of the 19th Amendment. First, I'd like to begin with a bit about the National Archives, although after the wonderful introduction that Pam gave, I'm going to be repeating a bit of what you've already heard. Most people know the National Archives as the home of the Declaration of Independence, the United States Constitution, and the Bill of Rights, which are on permanent public display in the National Archives Rotunda, which you see pictured here. But we preserve, protect, and provide access to all the permanent records of the federal government, which amounts to billions of individual documents. And those records document many of the most important milestones in American history, which of course includes the 19th Amendment. When I began to develop Rightfully Hers, however, I quickly realized that many people had never heard of the 19th Amendment or the women's suffrage movement. Some people weren't even aware that women only won the vote 100 years ago. Those who did know something about women's suffrage tended to picture something like this. And this is a photograph from the 1913 Suffrage March in Washington, D.C., which I will get to later. But the narrative that many people associate with images like this goes something like, with Susan B. Anthony, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and Alice Paul leading the charge, women took to the streets to demand their rights. They marched down city boulevards and picketed the White House gates. For the crime of peacefully protesting for their rights, these heroines were arrested and jailed, where they endured horrific conditions and abuse. Nevertheless, they persisted until women received justice on August 18th of 1920, when the 19th Amendment was ratified and women won the vote. There is truth in this, but as is so often the case, the story that we think we know about major historical events is not the full story. And images like this, with all white, mostly upper middle class women, don't give us the full picture of who was fighting for women's voting rights and what it took for them to succeed. A bigger issue, however, is that there is a broad misunderstanding that the 19th Amendment gave all women the vote. In fact, millions of women across the country were already voters when the 19th Amendment passed, and many women, however, remained unable to vote after 1920. So evidently, there is more to the story than this picture can tell us. So in order to do justice to the legacy of the 19th Amendment and the generations of women who fought for their right to vote, Rightfully Hers offers a much more inclusive retelling of women's struggle for the vote that reflects the diversity of women and strategies engaged in the struggle to win the vote for 1/2 of the American people. But in order to understand the story of women's fight for the vote, we have to understand where the right to vote comes from in the United States. First, there is not a citizen's right to vote in the United States Constitution, not even today. The Constitution, when originally drafted in 1787, made no mention of qualifications for voting, and powers not reserved to the federal government by the Constitution were left to the states. Over time, the Constitution has been amended to limit states' power to exclude certain groups of Americans from voting. But the power that state governments have to determine voting qualifications for their residents dramatically shaped women's struggle for the vote. It also continues to be a major factor in our voting rights today. One other thing about the Constitution that we need to understand is that by design, it is very hard to change it. And to give you a sense of this, the first time that an amendment with the exact same text as the 19th Amendment was proposed in Congress was in 1878, but it never went to a vote. For 42 years, that same amendment was introduced at every session of Congress and either ignored or voted down before it finally passed and ultimately became the 19th Amendment. So what did it take for that amendment to finally pass? First, it took more than 70 years. The received wisdom has traditionally been that the birth of the women's suffrage movement happened in 1848 at the first Women's Rights Convention in American history, which was held in Seneca Falls, New York. Now, historians argue now that the origins of the suffrage movement are much earlier and much more dispersed. However, I'm going to pick up with the end of the Civil War, when women suffragists, many who were also abolitionists, hoped that they might secure their right to vote as Congress considered what the rights of newly emancipated slaves should be. And this is a petition, it's actually the earliest petition in the exhibit from 1866 for universal suffrage, where women suffragists were lobbying that the right to vote should be universal, meaning every citizen should have it. And it is signed by some of the most well-known women from the suffrage movement, which includes Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Susan B. Anthony, and Lucy Stone. Unfortunately, women suffragists were left disappointed when the 14th and 15th Amendment prohibited states from denying the vote on the basis of race, color, or previous condition of servitude, but extended no voting protections to women of any race. This really divided women suffragists, and some refused to support the ratification of the 15th Amendment if women, and by this they meant white women, were denied the vote. It got so ugly, in fact, that it split the women's suffrage movement into two factions. So for a time, the women's suffrage movement was composed of two separate national organizations that pursued two separate strategies. One that focused on winning women the vote in the state, and the other at winning women the vote nationally. Neither was very successful on its own at winning new voting rights for women, and eventually the two factions merged together after a couple of decades into the largest national women's suffrage organization in the country, which ultimately numbered more than 2 million women strong. Some suffragists in the meantime did not let the fact that they didn't have the vote keep them from showing up at the polls and trying to vote anyway. Susan B. Anthony was one such woman. She was famously arrested along with 14 other women for illegally voting in 1872. This is one of the records related to Anthony's arrest, ordering the U.S. Marshal actually to arrest her. Anthony wasn't the only woman who did this, and nor was she the first. Hundreds of women from California to Maine attempted this same strategy, not because they thought they could trick their way into the polls, but because they wanted to force a legal ruling on whether the 14th Amendment, which provides citizens equal protection under the law, granted them the right to vote. The question did make it to the Supreme Court, but the court ruled unanimously that the Constitution did not guarantee a citizen's right to vote and that the states could restrict voting rights to men. So the legal path to the vote was not a success. So why was this so hard? Why did it take so long for women to gain traction in their fight for the vote? Clearly, male politicians did not support enfranchising women, but a lot of women didn't as well. In fact, anti-suffragists organized and lobbied politicians just as vigorously not to give women the vote as suffragists did to press for their place at the polls. Of course, that begs the question, why on earth would women oppose their own enfranchisement? To start, the more than 70-year fight for the vote also marked a period of dramatic social change when women became increasingly active outside of the home and traditional ideas of gender roles began to shift. To some, the very notion that women belonged in the public sphere was perceived as dangerous and frightening. They feared that women's political participation would corrupt their moral virtue and disrupt the social order. But there is more to it than that. While women had not been very successful at gaining ground in their fight for the vote, at the end of the Reconstruction period in the South, in the late 1800s, former Confederate states had been very effective at suppressing the voting rights of African American men. Southern politicians feared that if women got the vote, it would include Black women. And if that happened, they believed it would be impossible to sustain Black men's disfranchisement. So debates over women's suffrage were driven at least in part by racial attitudes. And this was not just limited to the anti-suffrage movement either. If you look at this anti-suffrage postcard from the Georgia Association opposed to women's suffrage, the very last argument that it makes is that white supremacy needs to be maintained. But pro-suffrage, obviously white pro-suffrage women made the exact same argument, stating that if white women got the vote, white supremacy could be maintained that way. Race-based arguments were made not only in support of or in opposition to giving the women the vote, however. They were also made over whether or not women should get the vote by a federal amendment or through state action. Despite fierce opposition to women's enfranchisement, women were slowly gaining ground. Actually, women lost ground before they began to gain it again. One of my most interesting things I learned in developing this exhibit is that the first women voters in the United States were actually women in New Jersey, beginning in 1776, when New Jersey wrote its first state constitution. It only had a property qualification for to vote. And so women who met that qualification, which of course was a very small number of women, primarily single women and widows, since married women generally could not own their own property. But for the first 30 years of the Republic, women in New Jersey could and did vote until the state changed its law to restrict the vote to just white men of property in 1807. So after New Jersey women lost the vote, it wasn't until 1869 that Wyoming Territory gave women equal voting rights with men. Wyoming also became the first state after New Jersey to give women the vote when it achieved statehood in 1890. In fact, only states west of the Mississippi passed women's suffrage until Illinois gave women partial voting rights in 1913. Many states, when they made women voters, gave women equal voting rights with men. But in other instances, women only got limited or partial suffrage, like in the state of Illinois, meaning that women could only vote in certain elections. But if you have two separate ballots, on one for women and one for men, you've got a bit of a logistical nightmare on your hands come election day, right? So one of the most interesting records in Rightfully Hers is this patent drawing for a gendered voting machine. And if you look at the voting machine, on the left side, you'll see there are two separate entrances, and one is labeled ladies at the top, the other is labeled gents. And the door is on a turnstile, which is connected to a complicated system of gears. And the way it would work is if you were a woman, you would enter through the ladies' entrance, and those gears would operate to lock down the ballot measures that women were not allowed to vote for. And of course, if you were a man and you entered through the gents' entrance, all of the ballot measures would be open and available for them to vote on. As states began to slowly pass women's suffrage, suffragists intensified their lobbying efforts on all fronts. State-level campaigns to win women full or partial voting rights were stepped up where success looked promising. Enfranchised women pressured their elected representatives to vote for a federal amendment, and suffrage leaders fervently lobbied the president and Congress to do the same. So let's return to our marchers. As greater numbers of women joined the fight for the vote, suffragists began to stage large and dramatic parades and processions in cities and towns across the country that brought unprecedented visibility to their cause and helped to gain public support. One of the most consequential marches, which is pictured here, was held in Washington, D.C. in 1913. Although they're not pictured in any of the photographs from the march, we also know that women of color participated too. One woman who was there was Marie Bottineau Baldwin. She was a member of the Turtle Mountain Band of Chippewa Indians, and she was in law school at the time and marched with other female lawyers in the parade. Alice Paul, who organized the DC March, attempted to discourage Black women from participating, however. Ultimately, Paul was overruled and Black women joined the procession, though they marched with segregated treatment. One woman that refused to do so was Ida B. Wells Barnett. Wells Barnett traveled to Washington, D.C. from Chicago to participate in the Suffrage March as a delegate from the state of Illinois. She famously refused to comply when she was ordered to march at the back of the parade with other African Americans and march with the Illinois delegation as she intended. African American women and men played a really crucial role in the struggle for women's suffrage. They formed a robust network of Black women's clubs that actively worked to win women the vote and to promote other reforms, and they were also active in white-led suffrage organizations as well. However, as racial tensions mounted in the movement, some white women suffrage leaders increasingly discouraged or excluded Black women from their activities. Some did so because they feared that including Black women in their cause endangered their chances of winning the vote. Other suffragists held racist beliefs and preferred a segregated movement. But African American women suffragists refused to accept this discriminatory treatment, no matter the reason. Wells Barnett is one of 6 suffragist spotlights that are scattered throughout the Rightfully Hers exhibit, and I just wanted to quickly mention the other women who are also featured. Mabel Pinghao Lee was a Chinese immigrant who marched for women's enfranchisement, even though she was barred from becoming a United States citizen. US law at the time banned Asian-descended immigrants from naturalizing. Therefore, she remained unable to vote when the state of New York adopted women's suffrage in 1917 and after the 19th Amendment was ratified in 1920. Rose Schneiderman was a major force in New York City's labor community, who used her powerful oratory and skills as a union organizer to rally working class support for women's suffrage, which proved critical in turning women's fight for the vote into a mass movement. Adelina Otero Warren was an influential Mexican-American suffragist in the state of New Mexico. She was especially effective at engaging with Spanish-speaking men and women to gain critical support for women's voting rights. And she led a relentless campaign to keep pressure on New Mexican state legislators until they voted to ratify the 19th Amendment. Fannie Lou Hamer was a sharecropper in Mississippi when she began her struggle to register to vote. She persisted until she was successful and then devoted herself to facilitating voter registration among other African Americans, for which she received repeated threats on her life. In 1964, Hamer challenged the all-white political establishment in the state of Mississippi in nationally televised testimony that proved pivotal in the struggle for African American voting rights in the U.S. South. And Vilma Martinez was a leader in the Mexican American civil rights movement during the 1970s and played a critical role in expanding voting rights for Spanish-speaking citizens and other language minorities from discrimination at the polls. Hamer and Martinez were obviously voting rights activists who fought for the vote after 1920, but as far as I'm concerned, any woman who fights for the vote for women is a suffragist. But let's return back to the struggle for the 19th Amendment, where women are marching by the thousands, petitioning by the millions, and women are voting too. Finally, suffragists have some real momentum behind their cause, and then the country declares war against Germany and enters World War I. And just like the conclusion of the Civil War, women suffragists are once again divided over what to do. Most fear that fighting for the vote while U.S. soldiers fought abroad would be seen as unpatriotic, so they stopped publicly agitating for the vote and directed their energy to supporting the war effort. The militant branch of the suffrage movement, which was a small but outspoken minority who were led by Alice Paul, persisted in their public protest. They were the first Americans, in fact, to picket the White House, and they openly criticized the president for fighting a war to, quote, make the world safe for democracy, end quote, while women at home lacked full citizenship rights. The Wilson administration did not respond kindly, and the picketers were harassed, arrested, jailed, and subjected to deplorable treatment while they were in prison. Although their protest activities were not popular with many suffrage leaders or the public, Americans were nevertheless shocked that government authorities would jail women for demonstrating peacefully for their rights. Collectively, women's contributions to the war effort, sustained political pressure, and numerous state suffrage victories that had significantly increased the number of congressional seats representing women voters was finally enough to turn the political tide in favor of women's enfranchisement. And on June 4th, 1919, Congress passed a joint resolution proposing a women's suffrage amendment be added to the Constitution. I said, however, that amending the Constitution is really hard, and suffragists' fight for their long-sought amendment was not quite over. For a proposed amendment to become part of the Constitution, it not only has to pass both the House and the Senate by a 2/3 majority, it also has to be ratified by legislators in 3/4 of the states. For the 19th Amendment, that was a grueling process to secure enough state ratifications, which culminated in the state of Tennessee. Tennessee's ratification of the 19th Amendment came down to a single vote cast by Harry T. Burns, a 24-year-old freshman legislator. Byrne had intended to vote against the measure. However, he promised his mother, Feb E. Byrne, that he would vote for ratification should his vote be needed for it to pass. When it came time to vote on the 19th Amendment on August 18th of 1920, he kept his promise to his mother, and the measure passed by a single vote. With Tennessee's ratification, the 19th Amendment had received the requisite number of state ratifications to become the law of the land. It took 3 generations of relentless political pressure to win this landmark voting rights victory, and resulted in arguably the most dramatic expansion of the electorate in American history. But I'd like to take a closer look at what the 19th Amendment actually says. And I'm just going to read the first sentence on this slide, which says that the right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of sex. In effect, the 19th Amendment won women the vote. But if you read it, it is not an affirmative statement that women have the right to vote. It just says that a citizen's vote cannot be denied because of sex. There's nothing in the amendment that prevents states from denying women the vote for other reasons, and for that reason, the ratification of the 19th Amendment was not a victory universally enjoyed by all women. So before I close, I'd just like to touch on a few of the voting rights stories in the exhibit that continue beyond 1920. First, the 19th Amendment did not apply to citizens that lived in territories like Puerto Rico or the Federal District of Columbia. So Puerto Rican women who had to fight for another 15 years before their territorial legislature gave all adult women the right to vote in 1935. Residents in the District of Columbia also have never enjoyed the same voting rights as citizens in the state, and it has only been through a piecemeal legislative process throughout the 20th century that district residents have gained voting rights, including the right to vote for president. Today, residents of Puerto Rico and DC still lack voting rights and voting representation in Congress that are equal with US citizens that live in the state. The 19th Amendment also did not extend the vote to women who were not yet recognized as US citizens, including some Native American and Asian immigrant women. It wasn't until 1924 that all Native Americans were granted US citizenship by the federal government, and Asian immigrants were largely prohibited from naturalizing until changes to immigration laws in the mid-20th century lifted those restrictions. Even as citizens, Native, Asian, and other minority Americans often faced discriminatory barriers to voting that were similar to those experienced by African Americans in the Jim Crow South. As I already mentioned, after Reconstruction, Southern states had effectively disfranchised most Black men. And the discriminatory laws and practices that kept many Black men from voting also kept many Black women in the South from the polls as well after the 19th Amendment was ratified. While targeted at African Americans, these measures also kept many poor and poorly educated people of all races from the polls, and a disproportionate number of them were women. African American women and men risked their lives fighting for their civil rights, and they finally secured a landmark voting rights victory with the passage of the Voting Rights Act in 1965, which outlawed many of the discriminatory practices that had disfranchised Black voters for decades. The Voting Rights Act included a provision that required federal oversight of changes to voting laws in states with a history of voter suppression. However, in Shelby County v. Holder in 2013, the Supreme Court, in a 5-4 decision, struck down the formula in the law that was used to determine which states were required to clear changes to their election laws with the federal government. Therefore, that provision in the law is currently unenforceable until Congress passes a new formula, which has not happened to date. The question of what American citizenship rights should be and who should be entitled to them has been an ongoing national conversation since our nation's founding, and it is a debate that continues to this day. But like Mrs. Fresdahl, I hope you will all honor the legacy and sacrifice of the generations of Americans who fought to open the polls not only for themselves, but to millions of other Americans by casting your ballot every election day. Thank you all for your time and attention listening to my presentation, and I look forward to answering your questions.
Thank you very much, Corinne. What a fascinating story it is. I've learned so much already from this event. You mentioned all the events that happened after 1920, and you mentioned Harry Burns, who did what his mother told him to do. One of our one of our guests was wondering what kind of further career did he have as a legislator? Do we know? Was that the end of his career?
No, I mean, I do have to say, I have not, I did not make intense study on his political career beyond August 18th of 1920. But I do believe that he had a career in politics that continued for at least a couple of decades after that.
And the 12 states that didn't ratify the amendment, did they ever do that after the fact, if only just to make themselves look better?
Yes, some, well, I'm not going to comment on the motivations for those states to ratify after, vote to ratify after the amendment had been ratified, but yes, at the moment I've forgotten, there might be one or two states that haven't yet, but I think most states since then have voted to ratify the amendment.
Did the two major political parties differ in their support for the amendment back then? Can we learn anything now from their attitude towards the amendment then?
Yes, and suffragists also appealed to the parties, in particular the Republicans, for trying to get woman suffrage added to the party platforms as well.
I read recently in the newspaper that Susan Anthony, who was fined because she tried to vote illegally, that she was recently pardoned by the president. And I thought, well, this shows us how topical this whole issue is. But I heard that there was quite a ruckus about the pardon. Did that reach the National Archives as well?
I mean, I think the ruckus was mostly among individuals. I have Susan B. Anthony is not alive and with us today, right? To tell us how she would feel about the pardon. And I generally try to avoid putting words into historical figures now. Some individuals have argued that Susan B. Anthony wouldn't have wanted to be pardoned. And I think it's interesting, she was found guilty of illegally voting and she was fined $100. However, she never paid that fine.
Unfortunately, time-wise, this is our final question, Corinne. It's clear that for women of color, even after 1920, there was still a long way to go to have full access to the ballot box. Were there any notable white suffragists who continued to help them in their struggle? Many of these women were abolitionists as well, or was the battle over and that was it?
Well, certainly after 1920, the struggle for the 19th Amendment, which united women across a broad spectrum of different, certainly women spun off and pursued other issues that mattered to them. And I really did not, can't really speak with authority because I have, one of the things that Rightfully Hers did is to focus on the story of the struggle to secure the vote for one half of the people, which is why we tell such a broad story of the diverse basis upon which women were denied to vote, and also the broad spectrum of strategies and women who were engaged in that struggle. So I can't really comment on specific individuals. Many white suffragists really stepped back from the public stage after the struggle for the 19th Amendment was over. It was, as I said in my remarks, a very long, hard, brutal struggle. And so, many of those women either took a step back or pivoted to other issues. And unfortunately for women of color, the struggle continued, and they could see this coming. With the disenfranchisement of African American men, it was no surprise to anybody that Black women weren't able to either vote at all or were quickly disfranchised after the amendment was ratified in 1920.
Thank you very much, Curator Corinne Porter of Rightfully Hers. I wish we could all go to Washington to see the exhibition live, but fortunately, you were able to be here to tell us about it, and a fascinating story it is. Thank you very much, Corinne. I would now like to invite the Ambassador of the United States, Piet Hoekstra, to introduce our guest of today, Congresswoman Liz Cheney.
Thank you. Great to be with you. Liz, as a former member of the House, I'm going to take the liberty of referring to you as Liz and not necessarily Congresswoman or Chairwoman Cheney, if that's all right. But since you can't protest at this point, I think I'll just continue down that lane. Good. Thank you very much. Number one, say hi to your dad for me.
I will. Thank you.
As members of the House, we always like to refer to our states as having our jobs as representing the great state of Michigan or the great state of Wyoming. The great state of Michigan ratified the 19th Amendment earlier than the great state of Wyoming. But back in 1869, when it was a territory, they earned the title of the Equality State. And that's because they gave women the right to vote back in 1869. So they beat Michigan.
If I may interrupt you, Mr. Ambassador, they didn't give the right, they recognized the right.
They recognized the right, yes. Absolutely. Thank you. The other thing is that Wyoming will be in a unique position. I think most of the pollsters are predicting that after the November election, 67% of the Wyoming congressional delegation will be made up of women, and that may be the highest number of any one of the 50 states in Congress. The entire representation of Wyoming in the House of Representatives will be women. Of course, it will be one. But it is also expected that after the November election that 50% of their Senate delegation will be women. So 2 out of the 3 people from Wyoming will be women. So congratulations. That's
Thank you very much.
It's a great achievement for the state of Wyoming, and Michigan has a ways to go to even get close to 50%. But Liz has a great track record. She worked at the State Department and made her way into Congress. I started in Congress and made my way over to the State Department. So we've had some similarities in careers, and we both spent time in the private sector. But what I think is very, very impressive is in her second term, she was elected to be the chair of the House Republican Congress, which tells you the esteem of which her colleagues hold her in. I've checked with my congressman, Bill Huizenga. He's a big fan.
That's mutual.
And so he's trained well. He used to work for me. But just a couple of people who had that job before when I was in Congress. John Boehner, who went on to become Speaker of the House. Mike Pence, who went on to become the Vice President of the United States, and last night accepted the Republican Party nomination for a second term in office, which will be decided on November 3. So for a person to be with us tonight, it's an honor to have Congresswoman Liz Cheney from the great state of Wyoming. Liz, thank you for joining us.
Well, it's my pleasure, Mr. Ambassador. Thank you very much for having me, and I'll make sure to let my folks know you said hello, and they pass their greetings on to you as well. It's a real pleasure to have the chance to be with everybody today, and I know I have a constituent, Jennifer Walsh, who's the Consul General, I believe, in Amsterdam, who's helped organize this event. And it's just a real pleasure to be able to be with you to help commemorate the 100th anniversary of the ratification of the 19th Amendment. And of course, this year we also last year had the 150th anniversary, as Ambassador Hoekstra mentioned, of women being able to vote in Wyoming for the first time. And that's something that we're very proud of. We do still have a long way to go. I'm thrilled that the ambassador mentioned that we're on the verge of having 2/3 of our congressional delegation be women. And we have got record numbers of women serving in the House of Representatives. And we have record numbers of women running this time around as well. So I think that we're in a position where we're going to continue to see tremendous progress, continue to see women being willing to put their name on the ballot, throw their hat in the ring, and begin to serve. Women serve, of course, in a whole range of ways, not just obviously in elected office, but in our local communities, as moms, in our foreign service, in the executive branch in a number of ways. But it's something we're very proud of and something that I think is very important. And I'm very pleased that we've been able to have the kind of celebrations that we've seen this year. It's interesting, I know you were talking a minute ago about the president's decision to pardon Susan B. Anthony, and I was very supportive of that decision. I think when you go back and look at the history of what happened, when she was accused of the crime at that point of voting, at her trial, the judge did not even let her speak in her own defense. And then the judge dismissed the jury, and he just issued the verdict that she was guilty on his own without even letting her speak. And my understanding is that's why she decided she wasn't going to pay the fee, the penalty. And there were some people who said, she didn't pay the fine because she didn't want to give any credibility to the verdict. And I think some of those people said they also didn't like the pardon because they thought it gave credibility to the verdict. I thought the pardon was exactly the right thing to do. It frankly made clear that the verdict, the way that the trial was conducted, the fact that she wasn't allowed to speak, and frankly, obviously the fact that, at that point it was a crime for women to vote. That's what I believe the pardon said. And so I think it was an important thing to do.
Thanks to Corinne Porter, we were able to get a fascinating glimpse into the history of this important historical moment.
Yes.
And Gail Collins did the same thing recently in her column in the New York Times with the title, "Women Have Been Voting for 100 Years. What do we have to show for it?" Need I say more? She regards it as a big flop. How would you answer that question, and what role do you see for the Equal Rights Amendment in ensuring American women full equality for the law?
Well, thank you for the question. I actually would say I don't believe Gail Collins would say that women voting was a flop. I think if you look at a number of things, first of all, I think it's really important for us as women and for those of us who are elected officials to recognize that women don't only focus on a certain range of issues. Sometimes that's how these discussions go. There's talk about, these are women's issues and these are not. And some elected officials only speak to women about what they believe are women's issues. I think it's hugely important for us as women and as elected officials to recognize that women care about every issue. I spend a significant amount of my time, for example, on national security issues. That may not be a traditionally defined woman's issue, but I think we need to celebrate the fact that we have so many women. Women have views all across the political spectrum, just as men do, and I don't think we ought to be in a position where we're, sort of focusing on only a particular set of issues when it comes to women.
I've often felt myself as a woman, and of course as a voter, that the term women's issues has something belittling about it, as if those are the homey, not dangerous issues, not serious issues, that those are the ones that women are allowed to get worked up about. So I definitely agree with you about this. And I have to admit, the title of Gail Collins' column also, the big flop was in the text, but the title was Unfinished Business. So perhaps that's...
I think that's fair.
Yeah. Much has been said already today about Wyoming. which was the first state, then a territory, to recognize women's rights to vote. There are some interesting theories about why that was, and one of them I read was that Wyoming then had a population consisting of 6 men to 1 woman, and that they were hoping that by making Wyoming a more woman-friendly state, that they would be able to get some more women in. But according to the National Conference of State Legislatures, Wyoming currently ranks 49th out of the 50 states in the percentage of women in the state legislature. Wyoming does have a good record when it elected Nellie Taylor Ross to become a female governor. She won a special election to succeed her deceased husband in 1924. But it hasn't elected another woman governor since, and that was almost 100 years ago. What are your feelings about your mission to improve the position of women in the Wyoming legislature and in statewide offices?
Well, we have terrific women who are running this year, both for seats in our legislature. We have 5 statewide elected officials, and of those, 2 are women. And as Congressman Huckster, Ambassador Huckster pointed out, this time around, both, it's interesting because actually the Republican and the Democratic candidate for our Senate seat are both women. And the Republican and Democratic candidates for our House seat, I'm the Republican, and my Democratic opponent is also a woman. And so we have, I think for the first time also, all of the top candidates for the 2 federal offices that are up this time around are women. So I think that...
what has changed to make that happen?
Well, look, part of it I think is we have to get more women candidates. We've got to make sure that we have, that women are willing to step up and serve. But I also think it depends, look, I don't think that it's an accident, for example, that in the last election cycle, the Democrats made a very significant and successful effort to target Republican women, to make sure that Republican women in the House, many of them were at the top of the target list for the Democrats. And so, and that was too bad. I understand why they did it, and it was effective. And so I think that it's important for us to make sure that women are willing to step up, that women have the support they need, young women have the role models they need to know that they can get in and serve. But I also think substance is important, and I don't think we should go down the path of thinking that women are all interchangeable, because I certainly think there are some women who are more effective, better representatives, have a better handle on the issues than others do. I don't agree with people just because they're women. And I think that's an important thing to remember also.
Yeah. Do you see yourself, how do you see that others see you as a role model?
Well, it's very interesting. I spend a lot of time in the position that I'm in talking to young women around the country who are interested in campaigning, who are interested in becoming candidates. I spend a lot of time helping women who currently are candidates. And one of the things that I see that I really try to dispel women of this idea. Too often, I think, women come to me and they say, here's a list of all of the things that we don't know how to do. We've never run for office before. And so, I don't know how to fundraise, or I don't know how to do media appearances, or I don't know how, women sometimes are much more responsible about assessing their weaknesses than the men candidates are. It's not always true, and I don't mean to generalize, but I see that. And I think that's where women like me who are elected, who do hold office, have a really important role to play in saying to the women who are thinking of running, look, the men don't know what they're doing either. The men who've never run before don't know how to do those things.
But they just jump right in.
Right, exactly. And I think we need to encourage the women more and more just to jump right in. That's the only way you learn, but also to make sure they know they have support. So through our National Republican Congressional Committee, through a number of our women members, we are seeing a real increase in resources and support and guidance to women candidates in particular who are getting into these races.
The NCSL, which I just mentioned, the National Conference of State Legislatures, has data that show that at the beginning of this year, only one state in the U.S., Nevada, has achieved gender parity in its state legislature. In 37 of the 50 states, women are still under 35% representation. What does this mean for how states are governed? Does it have an actual impact? Does it matter?
Sure, it matters. I think about, I tend to right now be focused obviously on this election cycle that we're in and taking sort of politics and taking partisanship out of it. I think that if you talk about women across our country, if you talk about moms in particular, and you ask, what do those mothers want from their government? Most of the time moms are extremely busy, especially in the age of COVID now, where mothers all across our country are having to homeschool essentially. The majority of our school districts are not back in class. Where they're trying to work from home, where the economy is in a situation that is challenging, where we have in a number of our cities right now rioting happening. There are a whole range of things going on, and I think what the mothers and the women across the country want is they want to know the government is going to take the steps that are necessary to make sure they're safe, that their kids are safe, to make sure that we defeat the virus. Women tend to be pretty, they've got a lot of common sense, pretty focused in terms of, listen, I don't want to hear a lot of partisan political attacks on each other, partisan political speeches. I want to know that things are going to get done. I think a lot of women want to make sure that our government is going to hold the Chinese government accountable for the spread of this virus. So I think that a lot of times women tend to approach issues, particularly political issues, from a really, kind of a common sense approach. And, they want to cut through a lot of the noise and just get things done. And so I think that it does help to have more women at the table, certainly. And it helps to have women with diversity of viewpoints as well.
Let's talk about the parties. Of the women currently serving in state legislatures in the U.S., there are more than twice as many Democrats as Republicans. The House of Representatives has 88 Democratic women and 13 Republicans. In the Senate, 17 Democratic women compared to 9 Republican women. And 2 of those 9 hold their seat by appointment, not by election. What do you think is the cause of this significant disparity in party affiliation when it comes to the role of women in politics? And of course, what can we do about it?
Well, I think, as I mentioned before, if you look at the women in the House, there was a very concerted effort in the 2018 election and the 2016 election as well, where, Speaker Pelosi, who, was managing sort of the democratic process in terms of the party process, really targeted Republican women, people like Mia Love in Utah, for example. Really targeted women for a number of reasons, but partly because it helps to be able to show we don't have a lot of women and we do need to do better. That's why I'm really proud of the focus and the effort that we've had through our National Republican Congressional Committee this time around, in particular to encourage women to run. And we have historic numbers of Republican women running. Historic numbers of veterans running, historic numbers of minority candidates running, all across the board. I think that it's really important for the House on both sides of the aisle to reflect what our nation looks like. And I don't think that it's a healthy thing to have, the House conveying that somehow women all march in lockstep on particular issues, because we simply don't. And, if you look, for example, at the issue of abortion, the majority of American women, according to most polls, don't believe in a right to abortion up until the 9th month of pregnancy. The majority of women in the House do believe that. And I think that's wrong. I think we ought to have more pro-life women in the House, just as one example.
we've going back to recent events in politics, I think some of this has gone all over the world. We've seen interesting incidents of mansplaining, as it's called, to female members of Congress, including yourself, and of male members addressing female colleagues in a manner that I think most people would qualify as abusive. I think you know what I'm referring to. How should female legislators, no matter what party they're in, how should they call out sexist or misogynist behavior on the part of colleagues, press, others? What's the most effective way to deal with this?
You know, that's a really important question. I've had a long career. I've worked, practiced law. I've worked at the State Department. I've worked in politics, obviously now in elective office. And, certainly have faced sexism in my career.
And how have you dealt with it? Tell us, how have you dealt with that?
Well, I have found the most effective way usually to deal with it is to go out and beat the men that are doing that, prevail over them, succeed better than they
beat them over the head or beat them at the ballot box?
No. I mean, defeat them in terms of whatever the argument is, whatever the issue is, to prevail. And it's true, many times women have to work harder than men, but I did not, for example, think that it was a good thing that one of my colleagues took over an hour of time on the floor of the House in response to one of the incidents that you're mentioning, to create a situation where it really seemed like women were victims. I mean, look, politics is a very, very nasty business. And yes, it is absolutely true that women in politics, women in many fields of business face sexism. But I think the right way to handle that is to always be the most professional, most prepared, smartest, toughest person in the room, and not to, sort of declare yourself a victim. I find that really, in many ways as damaging as deciding that there are only a particular set of issues that women can be interested in.
But this did do a lot to address the issue of sexism in politics in a way that I don't remember ever seeing before. It was effective.
Well, I mean, I'm not sure it was effective. I always remember, when I was in law school, we had a class on professional ethics, and the professor was a male, and he was, I think, trying to do a good thing. And he asked us at the beginning of one class, he asked everybody in the class to list all of the reasons why women tend not to succeed at law firms in the same numbers that men do. And he was writing the answers on the board. And I found it to be such a troubling class because, there you are, 50-50, 50 men, 50 women in that room, young people competing, it was competitive law school, competitive class. We're all working hard. We're all competing. And all of a sudden you've got somebody who's saying, now we're going to need to give the women some extra help because otherwise the women can't make it. And I've never forgotten that. And I just think it's really important for women. Look, there's no reason why we need extra help. We need to go out there and we need to fight hard and we need to earn our success. And we need to show men and women that we're the most competent, best ones for the job. And I think it really does damage when we become portrayed as victims because we certainly aren't. And I think that, we need to give young women role models to follow who show how we're achieving real success in the world, not because we've had some kind of extra help or support or because we're victims.
One of the interesting aspects of the talk by Corinne Porter just now was about how the vote, when it was finally adopted in the amendment, went to white women. And she mentioned a whole group of women of different ethnicities who were also fighting that same fight. And what else needs to be done, federal, state, local levels, all levels, to ensure that all eligible voters in the U.S. have a fair shot at exercising their voting rights?
Yeah,
Are we there yet?
It's very important. And I think we need to do everything we can to make sure that everybody who's eligible to vote can vote. But we also need to make sure that people who aren't eligible can't vote and that we don't have fraud at our polls.
Susan B. Anthony.
Yeah, I mean, look, I think, it was a different time then, obviously, but we're not in a situation today where you've got people that are prevented by law because of the color of their skin or because of their gender from having suffrage. I think that it's something that's important that we make sure that is done right, partly and mostly because our electoral process and our system depends upon people having confidence in the outcome. And so when you have a situation where you have people voting who shouldn't be, you have people that, we've got all these stories now as ballots are being mailed out in many jurisdictions. And there's nothing wrong with mail-in voting at all. And certainly Americans who are overseas, certainly our servicemen and women, many people vote by mail. But when you have a situation that you do today where some places are just mass mailing ballots when people haven't asked for them, it creates a real challenge for our local election officials, our local election offices. People are receiving 3 and 4 ballots. People don't know if you voted by mail and then you show up on election day. Can you vote? It's a situation we've got to take great care about. I mean, there's nothing that is more at the heart of how our republic functions than the fact that we get to vote for our leaders. And I think it's really important that we protect that, both from, bureaucracies that could prevent votes from being counted or could allow people to vote who shouldn't, and also from foreign influence, which is certainly a big challenge we face as well.
Looking forward to the future of voting for another generation, in 1971, the 26th Amendment was ratified, and that lowered the voting age to 18. I remember vividly my first election. I was finally part of that whole big thing of society. Unfortunately, young people are notoriously unlikely to go to the polls. How do we change that? How do we get them
Yeah.
galvanized?
Well, one of the stories that I tell and one of the memories that I have that I just will never forget, I worked for an organization called the International Republican Institute when I was right out of college. And I was part of an election observer mission to some parliamentary elections in northern Kenya. This would have been in 1992. And we had been assigned to go watch voting take place at a polling place. It was, very, very rural part of Kenya, no roads that people didn't have cars. So people were walking to this polling place, and we got there early in the morning, and there were people lined up around the polling place, many of whom had walked miles and miles in the hot sun to come stand and cast their vote. And we had been there for just a little while, and members of the military showed up, and they chased everybody off. And it was a very threatening situation where it was clear that people were going to face severe consequences if they didn't leave and if they tried to vote. And I'm sure some of them felt that their lives were at risk. And those of us who were there on the observer mission sort of looked at each other and said, well, I guess we aren't going to have anything to report about today because the military showed up, the government didn't want people to vote, people were scattered. And then it was not more than maybe an hour or so later, and people started trickling back in. And I was so amazed and so moved that this right of voting was something that meant so much that people were risking their lives for it. And, when I talk to young people around the country, certainly to my own children, to their friends, and to groups of young people, I often tell that story and just remind them how few people in history, if you go back and you look at sort of all of human history and all of the people who have lived, how unbelievably rare and special it is to live in a nation at a moment where we get to decide what our laws are, we get to decide who leads us. That is just it's a sacred thing, and something that we have to absolutely encourage young people to be part of, to make sure that, the first time they can vote when they're 18, they do, and that it really matters and makes a difference. And I also tell them often, you can go look at elections over the course of, the last several years in particular and see how close they've been and see what a difference it makes district by district if people vote or don't vote. But it is a sacred and important obligation. We've got to make sure young people exercise that right.
Looking at the same situation in a different country, I remember vividly when the vote finally took place about Brexit, that a lot of young people didn't vote. And the next morning there were, I think, 4 million hits on Google. What does the EU actually do? And you just stop and think how the course of history could have been so different if this group of people had realized that it was their own future that they finally had the right to vote about. One last question. We don't have much time left, and I do want to thank you for taking time during this very busy period for a prominent Republican like yourself.
Thank you.
How does a candidate, a female candidate, defend herself against questions that are only posed to female candidates about how do you do it if you have a family, about your appearance, about your tone of voice? How can you defend yourself from being who you are as a woman candidate?
Well, I think that we have to remember what a huge benefit it is to be a woman. I think of, looking back, for example, on my time at the State Department, I worked on our programs in the Middle East, for example. And I found that when I, as a woman, traveled to countries like Saudi Arabia, the American male diplomats could only go to meetings with the Saudi male government officials. I went to those meetings, and then I also could go and sit with the Saudi women. And having that ability to really see all of Saudi society that way, having the chance to talk to everybody, for example, I found to be, just a huge and tremendous benefit. And so I think the other thing I often think about, I have 5 kids, and, I've thought when I look at making policy, when I look, for example, at foreign policy, so many of the lessons that you learn as a mother are really relevant for things like foreign policy. I mean, if you think about some of the real tenets that we ought to be abiding by, things like, empty threats diminish your power and influence. Well, that's true if you're a country. It's true if you're a mother. So it's also, I spent a lot of time when I was at the State Department working on women's programs across the Middle East. And what I found again and again and again was, if you really want to help, for example, increase economic development in a society, what you ought to do is go find the mothers and make sure the mothers can read. When you look at, rates of literacy among mothers, there's a really direct correlation between that and how a society is doing economically. So you see the massive impact that women have in their communities, in their families. And I just think we need more women who are on the public stage around the world to remind people of that, and never to think of the fact that we're women as a hindrance. I'm really blessed that I grew up with 2 parents, who never thought or taught us that being a woman was somehow, meant that we could only do certain things in life. And I think it's important for us to do everything we can to convey the notion that it's a real benefit to be a woman, and we bring to the table a particular set of skills and interests and influence and ways of operating that the men could learn a thing or two from.
So it's time has come for women like yourself in prominent public positions to finish the business of the 19th Amendment. Thank you very much for joining us this evening, Congresswoman Liz Cheney, and keep up the good work. Thank you.
Thank you. Great to be with you. Thanks so much. Good night.
Good night. I would now like to give the floor to Consul General Jennifer Walsh for the closing remarks of today.
Thank you, Tracy, and thank you to our special guests, of course, Corinne Porter of the National Archives of the United States and Congresswoman Liz Cheney, and all of you in the audience. I think that was a great way to commemorate the expansion of the we in We the People. But as tonight's program made clear, the fight for suffrage and equality didn't end with the 19th Amendment. And if you're a U.S. citizen, that struggle continues, and it's something that you need to take a role in right now. If you have not yet requested your ballot for the 2020 general election, please do so by visiting the website of the Federal Voting Assistance Program at FVAP, that's right, .gov. They have state-by-state instructions on what to do, and they'll get your ballot to you before Election Day. If you know that you have to return your ballot physically to the United States, you have a couple of options. If you're in the Netherlands, you can drop your postage-paid ballot off in our ballot box at the U.S. Consulate General in Amsterdam. If you do that, be sure and stop at the guard booth and get your I voted sticker. We don't want you to leave without that. Ballot material can also be sent through international mail, or you can use a express delivery service such as DHL, FedEx, or UPS. Those two latter alternatives, of course, will cost a little bit, but voting is priceless, so don't put a price on it. Make sure your ballot gets in time. Thank you again for joining us, and to paraphrase the suffragist slogan, vote and let us move forward into light.